Good evening. I'm introducing the lecture tonight. We are running an urban lab lecture. I want to introduce my colleague from the CCSF, Mono Simenon. And I'm Mona El Khafif. I'm running at CCA the Urban Lab for everyone who's not from CCA. We have a tradition, or at least now I would call it tradition because it's the second lecture, where CCSF and CCA Urban Lab are cooperating, bringing in professionals that are dealing with the application of GIS and digital media. And last year we had Google, Stamen Design, and Tim Sinnott from Green Info talking about the presence and future of digital data visualization. And tonight I'm happy to introduce our guests, Jean Becker, the augmented reality strategist and inventor of the Layer browser, and Sha Hang, who is a design technologist and also an architect, and who founded his own firm, Movity, and is now working together with Trulia. We titled the lecture tonight, Augmented Reality, Excursions on Digital Territories. And the mode of how we are running this series is usually that every guest is presenting for 20-30 minutes, and then we have at the end a little bit of a panel discussion where you can ask questions, or we'll try to get everything out of what they think about augmented realities. We have just some slides to introduce what we are doing. So as I already mentioned, Urban Lab, all the architects knows what this is. For those who are new to CCA, Urban Lab is an institutional research and design collective composed out of CCA faculty, students and professionals, and we are usually navigating between the curriculum, dealing with the urban issues as a general approach, and with external networks of professionals. We also have a set of travel programs, etc., etc. And one of the activities that we have is running the lecture series that is dealing with the application of GIS, and we also run GIS, ArcGIS workshops, usually in the springtime.
In cooperation with Mona and CCA, the GIS Education Center at City College of San Francisco also offers workshops in GIS. In fact, that's what we're primarily known for. One of our more popular workshops is the Gis Quick Start, which is a 15-hour workshop, very heavily packed with information. In addition, students get the software and other material or content to take along with them. So it's a really good opportunity if you're not familiar with GIS or you think you might want that skill to try it out and see if you like it. Again, they're only about 15 hours spread over a couple weeks. GIS is one of those skill sets that's it's very marketable. It's a growing industry, and if you're interested in it, it's a really good way to either build existing projects at your workplace or get additional jobs. It's just one of those tool sets that's ubiquitous, and it's used in a lot of different places. I know that most of you probably know what GIS is. For those that don't, or that might want a little bit more information about it, essentially what GIS is, it's a computerized mapping program, and we're taking layers of information and stacking them on top of each other. Really, what you can think about it is a way to visualize and analyze the real world. That's in fact what the GIS is trying to do. We're trying to bring in information and create this model of the real world so that we can analyze it and look for spatial patterns or solve problems and make better decisions. It's really used in almost every industry, as I said before, and it's just a really cool and interesting way to look at data as well. So I think hopefully when Jean and Sha talk, you'll kind of see how GIS is a little bit used in what they do, and that it's sort of one of these things that's not really important until you really need something mapped, and then all of a sudden it becomes a very important aspect of a project. So.
Okay, so we are going to introduce our presenters always in it before they present. So I'm going to introduce first Sha Hang. Sha studied, is actually an educated architect. I'm really excited about people coming from architecture understanding or learning how exciting maps are and creating an own profession out of it. Sha worked for Iwamoto Scott, mesh architecture, and also worked for data visualization at Stamen Design. And maybe you probably know the projects that Damon worked on crime spotting, and I'm sure Shah is showing some of the work today. He also co-founded a startup called Movity, focusing on data visualizations and cities. And I would really like to mention that they got an extremely great sponsorship of 1.4 million through angel sponsors and created an own business out of it. And I think it's really exciting how people's professional careers are developing, just dealing and focusing on real-time mapping. And I'm really excited about his presentation. His presentation is going to deal with isochronic mapping and disordered realities. Maps have long been static artifacts of place that we are looking at, and increasingly through maps, we are looking through a lens where we become a part of the map making. So how are these lenses augmenting and distorting, overlaying information onto and into our realities? So Cha will start with a theoretical and historical thread, and then he will talk about the work that he has done in several offices, as well as the work he's doing currently in his own office. So thank you very much, Cha, that you're coming and presenting.
Thanks. How do I get out of this? Can we turn the light down? I can't actually see anything right now. Or is that possible? Okay. Hi, my name is Shah. I actually only speak in a lowercase Helvetica. I hope that's okay with you guys. As Mona mentioned, I used to work for a while at a firm called Stamen Design in the Mission. Last year I started a company called Movity, which was focused on data visualization and mapping around cities, which we recently sold to a company called Trulia. So now we're a team at Trulia working on mapping and visualization. And what we've been doing all throughout, and what I've been thinking about all throughout, coming from architecture, coming from thinking about cities, is how can maps and visualization represent urban information? And we're here tonight to talk about augmented reality, which is a kind of bending and folding of the map onto our physical space. And Jean's going to be showing some amazing work that Layar is doing around this specific idea of augmented reality. But what I'm kind of a little bit more curious about is how our traditional maps have been shifting in response to this. What I'm curious about, and what I'd like to show you tonight, are some projects which kind of think about maps as lenses, maps as things we look through rather than look at. And I'm interested in this idea of distorting or folding or cutting maps, distorting these realities in order to make physical this information about urban space. And I've been thinking a lot lately, and I'll go into this later, about the idea of information as landscape. What is the topography of the data in our cities? But first, I'd like to go back a bit. I'd like to go back to this. This is the road map from the Britannia Road Atlas. This is I think this is the first road atlas of the UK. This was done in 1675 by this man John Ogilvy. And what this map is doing is tracing the route from London up to Land's End. And what they're showing in this map is, you start in London in the lower left, and you go up along this path, up each continuous strip all the way to Land's End. Many of these maps were made in this atlas showing, different destinations, different starting points. All of them are kind of, distorting this kind of notion, you see the compass rose is kind of shifting all around. And they're all incredibly specific. They're all kind of blind to the cities that are nearby. And probably like the most surreal example of these kind of travel maps was this map called the Route Finder, which was done in the 1920s in the UK. So this was when people first started, driving and taking leisurely trips. And so what the route finder was, you would buy a little matchstick pack, and it would come with all these little travel, all these kind of road trips you could take, and you would literally slot them into this watch. And this is the actual version of scrolling, but you would drive, and you would like move, you would twist the little knob as you were driving. Again, this is crazy, first of all. No one ever bought these because, well, it's really hard to drive and like kind of twist the knob at the right rate to know how far along the route you are. But they're also problematic because they're static. What happens now, right? What happens if you take a wrong turn or, kind of fall off that path? How do you get back? There's a kind of fear and blindness in them. They're incredibly specific, but they're also static and kind of very fragile in that sense. If you waver even the tiny bit, you'll be kind of lost. And this reminds me a lot about this quote. This is a quote by Beryl Markham from her book West with the Night. And this book that she wrote, West with the Night, is a memoir of her life. Beryl Markham was one of the first female aviators, in the style of like Amelia Earhart, and she would make these incredibly long transcontinental journeys, or like across Africa over the Atlantic, in the dead of night. And so she made all these journeys by herself in these planes with no landmarks, and she writes about this experience and says, the map is saying to her, I am the earth in the palm of your hand. Without me, you are alone and lost. And there's something terrifying here, and there's something kind of beautiful, too, about being so incredibly dependent on this map. But there's also this kind of what Kierkegaard refers to, what Kierkegaard calls anxiety, is this dizziness of freedom. What happens when you're lost in that night and all you have is the map at hand? And so, what I think we're approaching now with the work that we're doing, with the explorations we're making, and especially with the technology that we have now, is starting to flip this relationship around. Rather than reacting with anxiety, how can we react with curiosity? Steve Jobs is famous for saying, out of curiosity comes everything. And this next map for me represents, a lot of that curiosity and a lot of that kind of beauty. And it comes out of this book. I don't know how many of you guys know this book, but it's amazing. It's called Graphist Diagrams. It was published in 1974. And this was a special issue of the Graphist magazine, which was a graphic design, visual communication magazine. And it was originally going to be called, The Artist in the Service of Science, which I think is just an awesome title. But it was changed to be called Graphist Diagrams, and it's just full of amazing and gorgeous like maps and visualizations and diagrams. But the one I love the most is this map. This is a travel time map, but it's very different. This is a map by Kohei Sugiura, and it's showing Japan. If you think about Japan as kind of tilted, like a banana that's fallen over, it's been tilted over, and what he's showing in this map is not physical space, but temporal space. Japan has kind of been shrunken and shriveled and distorted to show, how far every city is in Japan from Tokyo by plane or by train. And all of a sudden, it changes the shape of Japan into this kind of visceral and beautiful object. And there's something here that's more about, possibility, the actual, the technology of man, like the airplane and the train, reshaping space, versus this kind of other kind of relationship where you're bound to this route along your destination. And what this is, I mean, it's kind of a graphic version of this photograph. But I think there's like an energy here that it's really beautiful. I mean, it's still static, but it's branching out. It's showing all these possibilities at once. Rather than showing constraints, it's starting to show opportunity. So how can we start to, look at cartography, at mapping with this eye towards, not anxiety, but curiosity, not kind of paralysis, but exploration. And these are the kinds of, projects we're working on today. One way is through animation. A client came to us and asked us, this was at Stamen Design, we have, our user activity is impossible to handle. We want to know what it looks like. And this was just a very early sketch for us to visualize what was the world that was actually being described by that activity. The idea around this sketch was that, the activity that was, the regions with the highest activity would be sharply in focus, where, regions that don't have any user activity, like India, like South America, like Africa, would just kind of fade away. So, in exploring this, it's been fascinating to me to see, like, what is our world when it's reshaped by these activities? What kind of weights or kind of distortions can we look at on our world through the lens of data? And here we're looking at, we're using animation. This was an old project I did to map out the growth of the New York subway system. And so here, what animation doing is not necessarily showing, the shape of the world, but kind of this subway system and the usage of it as this kind of circulation system in New York. You can start to understand, Midtown for all its, pros and cons, being this kind of throbbing heart of Manhattan, and you're starting to describe the city with biological, analogies rather than the strict kind of formalism of like the urbanism or the street or the grid. You're talking about circulation, you're talking about veins and how they kind of trickle out into the Bronx or finger out into Brooklyn. And a later project we did at Movity was actually exploring this for personal space. This was a project we did called We Places, where we were curious about, what does my San Francisco look like? So for me, I live in the Mission, obviously, and I, work downtown or in the Mission. And my San Francisco becomes very, very graphically different than my friend's San Francisco, someone who lives in Lower Haight or someone who lives in the Marina. We were starting to chart out and map out these check-ins that we were doing and trying to visualize, that kind of trail that we were making. And when we were launching it, it was really beautiful to see, where people took this, how many people saw this. We ended up having about, I don't even remember how many thousands of maps were generated, but some of my favorites are this one by Fred Wilson. He's a pretty famous VC in New York, and he travels a lot. And this was the first time he'd kind of seen like the world that he'd explored. And he got really excited about this. And on the other side is someone's blog post where, they took this trip through Thailand and had, left this kind of trail of information along the way, but now could kind of look at it again and reflect on this kind of, this geographical artifact that they'd made. And this kind of, not necessarily distortion, but incredibly deep personalization was really powerful for these people. And another way we're exploring this, this kind of urban information is through interactivity. Not just through animation, but through something that a user can explore themselves. This is an older Stamen project called Mapumental, and this was in collaboration with My Society, a nonprofit there. And what they were interested in was answering the question of where can I live if I want to have a 30-minute commute, a 40-minute commute, a 15-minute commute. And what this project became about was this interactive map that lets you kind of peel away these layers of London, and dragging the slider lets you get this immediately very visceral understanding of the shape of London, the impact of the subways, the easy places to get to, the kind of places that were maybe off the grid. And you could also start to match this with the average housing price. So you could answer questions like, if I wanted a 30-minute commute to downtown London and I can only afford a house that's £300,000, where can I live? And this project was all about answering that question. And we started thinking about that a lot at Movity as well. We were looking at the rental market, finding an apartment to live. And we started making maps like these. What we were interested in here was how do we start to tackle these much more kind of soft factors that are incredibly important in where to live, whether an apartment is good or not, whether it's a good value, whether it's safe. And we started making maps like these. So here, what we've done is started to render different types of information into different color channels. So the blue kind of washing over everything is the average price of an apartment on that block for, I think it's a 2-bedroom. So you can see the darker blues down in Sunset are cheaper, the brighter blues up in the Marina and downtown are more expensive. And what the green is the density of bars and restaurants. Where are the places to eat, the places to go out? And you can start to see places like the Mission or downtown or the Richmond pop out as these kind of clusters of activity. And in the red is crime. How many crimes have happened in this block in the past several months? And here you show, the crime in the Western Addition, in the Mission, in Hunters Point, in downtown and up in North Beach. And while I can, sit here and kind of describe to you the intricacies of this map, it's actually, I personally think it's very beautiful, but for users or for people, it's very hard to decipher. So what we started doing with this tool was actually building interfaces on top of it. So when we started to build interfaces on top of it, you would start off with a map that looked something like this without any filters. And you would say, I want to live somewhere that has at least 15 bars and restaurants nearby, which immediately calls out like all of the Sunset, all of Excelsior. You get that strip in the Mission, and you get these remarkably detailed kind of representations of the commercial zoning in San Francisco. You get like Market Street, you get Noe Valley, you get that strip on 9th and Irving, you get Richmond, you get Marina, and you get Divisadero. And you get this kind of large swath in downtown where there are tons of places to eat during the day. But if you start adding to that query, you start interacting with this map and say, okay, but I actually don't want to live in a place with a ton of crime nearby. All of a sudden, like the Mission drops out. My block is like gone. Tenderloin is gone, but Richmond is still there. That little quaint strip of Noe Valley is still there. And this was just like a very rough way to get a sense of the city, but it was really amazing to watch people start to gain this new understanding about, what kinds of places had what kind of characteristics, which places were dangerous, which places were safe. And which brings me to kind of think about, what we've been curious about in terms of information as landscape. these were some early sketches we did for a client at Stamen, mapping cell phone coverage data. So what we were interested in here initially was kind of trying to decipher out the locations of cell phone towers, drawing where what cell phones had been connected to which towers, and starting to, just very simply draw like a Voronoi diagram on top of this, a very simple way to represent, and visualize that density of San Francisco versus like something more sparse like Walnut Creek or like Sausalito. And so we started making these kind of drawings. We also started making these kind of sketches, looking at, if these cell phone towers have kind of boundary conditions, what cell phone towers do you start to encounter as you go along a certain route? Starting to make these very personal and very interactive experiences. How do you start to understand the many hundreds of cell phone towers you might run into along your simple commute down to South Bay or something like that? But what we actually ended up with were maps much more like this. We started generating heat maps out of the cell phone coverage information and started rendering it as like a topography or as like a hypsography, starting to kind of explicitly tackle what is the landscape of cell phone coverage. What are the valleys, like in the sunset, where reception gets low for this carrier? What are the kind of peaks, like maybe in the marina, where the cell phone coverage is much higher? And this stuff directly translated to a lot of things we were thinking about at Movity and now at Trulia in terms of mapping crime. What is the topography of crime in these various cities? We started mapping out crime explicitly, started making tools to filter this, but rendering it against this backdrop. We had done projects before at Stamen like crime spotting, which were beautiful in that they showed you all of the specific points, but they couldn't quite capture how much more crime happened in the Tenderloin than in the rest of the city. Unfortunately or fortunately, there are just incidents happening all over the city all the time. But if you start to put this on a scale, you start to show how dramatically the Tenderloin is separate from something like the Richmond. And we started doing this for tons of cities. We're at this point, we're almost nationwide with the crime coverage. But what we're really interested in, these kind of fascinating looks into these cities and really understanding this different kind of, not physical, not like, the Seven Hills of San Francisco kind of topography, but what is the landscape of safety in this city? This is New Orleans, this is East Bay. And in some sense, a lot of people have pointed out that, these are also kind of maps of density, but all these street crimes happening are just insane. And this is Chicago. And you start to see these very, very different kind of patterns. San Francisco has one clear center in downtown, but is, other than the Mission, has nothing really else. Chicago is a little more scattered, and so is the East Bay. And as we were working on this project, I started thinking back to a very old project I've done. Kind of embarrassed about this one, actually. But this was a project I did when I was living in New York. But what I was interested in when I was living in New York was I was poor, and I didn't know where all my money was going. So I was curious about seeing where the hell I was spending all my money. So I started mapping my spending in New York and started color coding it and started making an animation about it. What I found was, I started color coding it, so blue are like groceries, yellow is like, I forget, that's just like general like clothes shopping, green are restaurants, and purple is concerts. So I started to see, well, I worked in Dumbo, that gigantic blue tower where the corner store right outside of work I would always buy stuff at. And I lived in Williamsburg near that other gigantic blue tower, which was right off of the Marcy stop. But I started to understand that like my spending was not necessarily captured in what I thought were these big purchases, like a concert at Terminal 5 in Midtown, or a really expensive restaurant in Soho, but were this aggregation of all these much smaller purchases. But starting to understand this idea of not just information as topography, but information as like kind of a skyline. Like what is, I have a very specific idea of like what Manhattan's skyline is to me, but what is it of my spending? And I was kind of curious about that. And so started recently to think about that in the context of, not just my personal information, but all of this national information that we're starting to think about. How can we start to make physical, how can we start to make visceral this idea of information as landscape, not just as like red is bad, don't go there, but this kind of epic skyscraper of the Tenderloin and this smaller, more subdued one of the Mission. And if you start to play this, if you start to interact with this over time, you can start to have these very interesting kind of studies of the relationship between, maybe what starts off, this is the distribution of all crime in San Francisco versus the distribution of like narcotics crime in San Francisco, where everything else falls away except downtown, versus something more like vehicle theft, where a lot of these places are starting to pop up again. And yeah, just this, how kind of clean the floor looks when you just look at narcotics and where the narcotics crimes happen. We're also looking at this back again at Manhattan, again trying to think about the physicality of these, this information. How do you start to like bend and shift what is familiar about, for me, this topography of Manhattan skyline into something that is representing information. This, for example, is the number of bars and restaurants in Manhattan. So you can start to see lower Manhattan, you can see a second peak of kind of Midtown, and then it drops off really sharply after that, up into Harlem, Washington Heights, things like that. But starting to understand in a very explicit and visceral way, what is that skyline of I don't know, sociability or restaurants. Starting to play with that, I was kind of curious of the idea of Manhattan as like kind of a bar graph city. But looking at the average ratings, and finally looking at the number of ratings. So again, the number of ratings start to mimic that kind of restaurant density in Manhattan, but in maybe a more even distribution. And finally, going back, like something we've been thinking about a lot is how to distort shape, how to actually change not just the landscape or the kind of dimensionality of a map, but how to change the actual structure of a map, how to change its form. And I really like this project this is a girl named Xiaozi Chen. This is mapping different transportation methods. This is again isochronic, so distance in pixels is not geographic distance, but temporal distance. So you can start to see the different transportation methods. I think this is Paris. You see the transportation on the bike kind of bumping things out to the much more efficient car. And while this is truthful, what she's also done, which I think is really nice, is look at also the carbon footprint as distance. So then all of a sudden you get the inverted relationship, right? Driving a car, while it may be the fastest way to get somewhere, is the least efficient way to get somewhere. And then everything then down gets compressed when you're riding a bike. And I also like this, this little tool that Tom made at Stamen when we were thinking about, the tube map. And so, what is that changing shape of the tube? So then this is, again, temporal distance. So if you click on a station, everything is arranged in terms of how long it takes to get there. Clicking on a station that's maybe not as connected pushes out these lines in a very dramatic way. And I like to end on this because I think it's just a really fascinating kind of example to me. And for me, it evokes, it evokes a ton, this map I really love by Kohei Sugiura. Not just like maps as kind of like tools to be dependent on or artifacts to look at, but these really powerful and visceral in some ways lenses to look through and understand our space and understand the physicality of that space in a new way. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Shah. That was great. A lot of great work that you're doing. So up next, we have Gene Becker, the AR strategist. Gene is a leader in emerging technologies that blend the physical and digital worlds. As Layer's US-based AR strategist, Gene is responsible for building the creative ecosystem for the Layer Augmented Reality platform, working with brands, creative agencies, developers, and grassroots AR enthusiasts. Prior to joining Layer, Gene was director of the Hewlett-Packard, where he led advanced research and business development for web-based mobile and ubiquitous computing, co-founded a cloud services business, and led worldwide R&D for extreme gaming and mobility brand Voodoo PC. He is the founder of strategy consultancy Lightning Laboratories, a co-founder of RDev Camp, Unconference, and organizer of ubiquitous media studio Meetup. Gene studied engineering and computer science at MIT and Stanford and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. So let's welcome Gene.
Okay, thanks, and hi, everybody. All right, let's see. Let me just figure out where stuff is. That was amazing, by the way, Shah. Your work is incredibly compelling and beautiful. And by comparison, what I'm going to talk about at Layer, well, it's different. It pales in some ways. Okay, we're coming. Let's see. All right, does that work? That works. Okay, good. So, I'm Gene Becker. I'm with Layer. Layer is a venture-funded startup company based out of Amsterdam. Whoops, is this on a timer? Or did that just, okay. Well, so we're based out of Amsterdam. We're venture-funded, invested by Intel Capital. We've been doing mobile augmented reality now for a couple of years. This is on a timer, isn't it? All right. You an expert at this? Do you know how to have it not be on a timer? Because it's just auto-advancing here. All right, well, we'll just deal with it. Okay, sorry about that, guys. What I want to do is convince you in this talk that augmented reality is not just this curious technology, it's an emerging medium for expression. And in particular, it's an emerging medium that's really good for hacking time and space. Okay, now we're going to let it go to the next slide here. So I can't see you all, so I don't know for sure if hands are raised, but how many folks here have are familiar with augmented reality and have used it? Okay, looks like quite a few, actually. Okay, so it'll be a quick review. All right, this is really going to be... This is annoying. All right, if anybody on the tech crew knows how to get this to stop auto-advancing, I'd appreciate that. Otherwise, I'm going to be fiddling with it all day. Okay, so mobile augmented reality uses the phone basically to create a magic lens experience, to basically turn this into a window for seeing digital data overlaid on the physical world, making use of all of the sensors, all of the sensors in the device, GPS for location, the compass for direction, accelerometers for orientation, and the camera, both for providing a live video feed as well as for using camera for computer vision, for actually becoming a sensor for sensing the physical world. Okay, so an amazing package of sensors here. What we're trying to do with augmented reality is use all of them to create a sense of digital experience out of the context of the physical sensing and the presence of the physical world. So what I'm going to actually do is just go through a bunch of examples of what people have created on the Layer platform. So let me back up and give you just a sense. So Layer is an application that runs on smartphones that provides this augmented reality view, but it's also a platform where developers can create augmented reality. So as a company, we don't build beautiful maps and visualizations and augmentations. What we do is we provide this open platform with APIs so that web developers who also have a sense of graphic design and physical world experience design can actually create their own experiences. And so what I'm going to actually show you is work that's been done by a broad range of developers in the world. The Layer platform certainly has a lot of commercial applications, and I'll just mention a few of these. One of the really obvious things that you would use this for would be real estate. And so Funda is a company in Europe that has real estate listings, commercial and residential. And so they commissioned a Layer to visualize kind of where are the listings in the city, in this case Amsterdam. I don't know if this is the absolute best way to find real estate, but on the other hand, it's kind of an interesting and novel thing for people to kind of look through a lens and see, over there is something that might be interesting. I think where we want to get to is you want to be able to kind of be walking through the city and you want to see something that really looks cool and look through the lens and say, hey, what is that? What would it cost me to buy that? And, But at this point, we're just querying existing databases and doing simple visualizations on the world based on geolocative databases. It's, from a business standpoint, it's an experiment. This particular experiment was okay. I think the company was happy because they had thousands of people that actually used this experience, and a decent number of them actually kind of clicked through the buttons that said click to contact a broker about this property. So commercial application. Another one, so Groupon, daily deals are everywhere, and increasingly, we're seeing geolocated databases of daily deals, and so there's a Groupon layer, there's living social layers. People are kind of seeing these obvious things where you could say, what are the deals around me? And kind of give them this novel sort of visualization in space. We also see, folks doing commercial work. This is an example of a graphical representation of an Audi car kind of placed into the physical world. And a lot of folks are doing this. It's cute, and yet it's a way of, really kind of bending, sort of physical space and revealing hidden things that are out there. Advertising on bus shelters becomes a point of contact for augmented reality. So, if you see an advertisement for a movie, you essentially use your phone to click on it, say by using computer vision to recognize the image, and then suddenly that triggers some kind of a digital experience. So I think it's a really interesting concept when the entire world starts to become clickable, when all of the information that's already latent in the world actually becomes digital and available kind of at the wave of your phone. Sony Pictures created this cute little thing. These are characters from the Battle Los Angeles movie. When they released their DVD, they wanted to do a promotional layer, and so you have 3D models of aliens and ships and things like that. The ships are positioned above the world capitals in one of the best sort of alien invasion cliches that there is. It's not earth-shaking, it's not particularly artistic, and yet I think what we're seeing is a lot of companies experimenting with this whole concept of, how do I create stories that engage people in the places that they're in? One of our developers is a huge fan of the Beatles, and so he used a little AR to recreate the famous crossing at Abbey Road. Okay, so if you're at Abbey Road Studios, you can actually see the Beatles. it's neat, right? It's fandom. More seriously, the Rolling Stones commissioned an interactive layer to help promote the re-release of their classic album, Exile on Main Street. And in this one, actually what you could do is, at any given location, you could go into this layer, you could select a poster, an image from the Stones' sort of collection of historic images from their career. You could select a song from the album and basically place both of those in that location and then tag it as with a message to your friend to say, hey, check out what I left you here, a poster and a song right here in AR space. And there was a Facebook app, and you could do it from the mobile. And, you know, it's kind of neat when you start to interact with media in physical space, right? The fact that you could kind of stumble across a physical song that was hidden somewhere in this room and play it, I think is intriguing. You know, I said we're trying to make AR into a medium. I have to say we're really at the silent film stage of developing this medium. And if we were the web, this is 1994, and we're all building kind of gray web pages with basic black text on them, right? So it's emerging. People are playing and trying to figure out what will work. One of the things that sort of immediately jumps to people's minds is, okay, let's do tourism. Let's do, you know, sort of points of interest out of tour guides. And there are a lot of these out there, both in the layer platform as well as other places. This is a nicely designed one. The concept is very simple still. You just have, you know, locations pulled from a database that are touristic attractions, and then, you know, you can provide a guide for these things. And tapping through any of these icons provides more information, directions to get there, that sort of thing. The kind of standard thing you would expect from a digital tour guide application. What we're also seeing, though, is that more and more we're getting live data feeds and being placed into augmented reality. So this would be a feed from the USGS service, basically locating you know, earthquake tremors onto the landscape. Crime, of course, is popular. Shah talked a lot about some really fantastic crime visualizations. This is kind of a simplistic one. Basically, it just, you know, categorizes the different crimes pulled from a database and kind of shows you these little icons saying, well, you know, there was a burglary here, and, you know, over in another area there might have been an assault, and it's not particularly useful in the sense that you don't want to be walking through a high crime neighborhood like the Tenderloin with your iPad or your iPhone out in front of you and kind of peeking around. And yet, when you're standing in, let's just say, Palo Alto, and you're facing out towards the mountains and Stanford University, there's almost no crime to be seen. And then you kind of turn around towards East Palo Alto, and suddenly there's this incredible density. And, you know, you kind of get that at a very visceral level when you're standing on the ground and kind of noticing that. So, again, experiments. There are a lot of open APIs out there for services that have geolocated data. Twitter, of course, is one of them. And so for people that choose to have their tweets located, you know, they're basically available through an API. So an enterprising developer basically put together a layer to visualize tweets around you. And they called it Tweeps Around. And this is actually one of the more popular layers, I think, because there are people in there, right? People love other people, they love social experiences, and so Tweeps Around actually shows you other people. And so if you're ever at a conference and you expect that people are tweeting around you, you basically can just pull this out, look around, and you can see who's been tweeting. And it's always fun to find somebody and go up to them and say, show them their face and their tweet right there. Say, hey, I saw you. Similarly, Instagram, the lovely little photo app on iPhone, geolocates its photos. And so the Insta Photos layer allows you to see Instagram photos that have been taken near you in recent history, say the last couple of days. And again, I think it's neat to explore a neighborhood and just see random photos, but it's actually quite powerful when you're more in a gathering like at a conference or on a campus, and you're actually likely to see something that has some more social meaning to you, either because of the nature of the photo or the person who took it, something about the context. So all these threads, I think it's really fascinating to contemplate that the air around us is literally becoming full of these hidden digital representations. and in so many different guises, right? Everything from, pulled from databases to, sort of social media. It's a really, it's kind of a different world. In fact, when I kind of go out on a limb a little bit, I think of this as really a change in the fundamental nature of reality, right? We think we live in a physical reality of 3 dimensions of space and time. On top of that, what we're really doing here is we're adding another dimension, which is this kind of digital orthogonality, which says now there is always going to be digital media, digital experience, digital information, kind of in everything we do and around everything we do in the context of our daily lives. And I don't know what that means in terms of how it will actually change the way that people think and live, but it is pretty intriguing. People are making games for augmented reality. Here's a simple Risk-like game called Conquer. It identifies what city you're in, and every city kind of can be conquered by armies and tanks, and you're on a team, and people conquer your armies and so on. What happens when the world itself becomes an arcade game? There's certainly been a lot of folks building big games and sort of street games and so forth, more and more technology enabled. I think this is another really intriguing one because it kind of takes the spirit of play for people who are willing to actually indulge in it and puts it out on the street. It makes it very physical. Whimsical stuff, right? A hidden safari in the streets of Amsterdam. Historical visualizations, I think, are very interesting. These are, for me, one of the really nicest applications of AR that I've seen so far. Just because, history is something that we all have a really clear sense of what that means, and there are, incredibly deep historical archives of photographs. I mean, this is a snapshot of a layer that was actually built right here in San Francisco using imagery and video from the famous 1906 Market Street trolley car video, where somebody put a camera on the trolley and basically drove it down Market Street and filmed it the whole way down. And the thing that's actually kind of poignant about that is that the original film was done something like 2 weeks before the 1906 earthquake that devastated the city. And then right after the earthquake, somebody, I don't know if it was the same person, actually recreated that trolley ride essentially and took a post-earthquake series as well. And this layer actually allows you to see before and after photographs at each point along Market Street as you walk down there. And there's something about history and about kind of seeing these images which creates a very powerful sort of instantaneous narrative for you when you're in that space. Similarly, Stanford University hosted a project done by a journalist, Adriano Ferrano, who was there on a night fellowship, and he basically, told some of the important stories about the university quad through this notion of historical augmented reality. So, here's an old picture that shows a monumental arch that no longer exists there because it was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. This is something that most people at Stanford had no clue existed, and there's an incredible sort of story around how Jane Stanford commissioned a bunch of buildings right before the earthquake. Most of them were actually built with substandard construction techniques, and so they collapsed not even 2 years later when the earthquake struck. A little bit more contemporary history. I mean, if you're standing on the quad, you may or may not realize that, Condi Rice and President Medvedev from Russia actually had a meeting there at one point, and you can watch the video of Condi greeting Medvedev and escorting him out into the quad as you're standing into the quad watching this on your phone. It's a very interesting sort of dislocation of space and time. The city of Philadelphia actually commissioned a company that is a GIS company, Azavea, to basically take their library of 90,000 historical photographs of the city and geocode them and put them into augmented reality. So a huge project, but also one that I think showed an incredible commitment toward trying to create this story of history by a civic organization. We also have these other sort of interesting stories, visualizing the Berlin Wall in 3D. as a way to give people a sense of what it would be like to have this wall back in place and obscuring the city and cutting it in half for folks that actually didn't live with that. Here's another visualization that actually has a lot of emotional power for people. The notion of architecture mashed up with augmented reality I think is pretty good. So UAR is an app, urban augmented reality, created by the Netherlands Architecture Institute. And what they did was they've created models. I think there's now 400 or 500 different 3D models of buildings, either historical that are no longer there or future proposed designs that don't exist yet that are visualized in place. And this is a very popular app. This is also something where it's allowing citizens to actually engage in the kind of the process of urban planning and urban succession in a way that most people wouldn't get involved in otherwise. Kind of at the other end of the spectrum, this is a completely virtual building that is placed into physical reality. So this is a little bit like Second Life and First Life, I guess you could say, where you create artificial structures that have different kinds of affordances and information, quote unquote, inside them that you can sort of interact with and understand. And of course, these buildings can pop up anywhere. One developer created a boutique for streetwear, basically skateboard wear, so kind of urban underground clothing, and placed these shops in all of the high street shopping districts around the world. So you can go to Union Square in San Francisco and see the pop-up shop for this skatewear line. This is an interesting project here. Actually, Architecture OMI is an organization that's in upstate New York, and they commissioned a number of architects, working architects, to just experiment with augmented reality and say, what would it be like for you to create a structure and do that under the design constraints that you're doing this in this invisible world of AR on top of a field in upstate New York. And so there are actually some really nice movies of this on the web, but just showing a few snapshots of examples of 4 different studios, the Cleater Studio, Leeser, Colmack, and Daniel Libeskind, created as a result of this commission. And this is a sort of permanent installation, if you could call anything in AR a permanent installation there at OMI. Maybe not surprisingly, artists really gravitate towards this really interesting physical-digital dichotomy. It's a really interesting place to explore. So street art, vernacular art is everywhere, and so there's an app based on Layer that allows you to actually go out and find street art in your area. In a lot of cases, street art gets painted over or removed by the authorities, and so sometimes what you can do is you can find art that no longer exists but did exist there. And also, if you actually find art that you think is worthy of being shown to other people, you can actually take a photo of it and upload it as well. So it's a way of really extending the experience of of looking at vernacular street art both in time and in space. And it obviously draws in resources from the net. I mean, the database here is actually pulled from some of the Flickr groups where you have this incredible community of people who post street art work into Flickr groups, and there are thousands and thousands of images from around the world that feed into this application, so that wherever you go, you can really see, kind of where some of the works that people thought were significant. So museums are kind of getting into the act a little bit. So the Stedelijk is the equivalent of the Museum of Modern Art in Amsterdam, and they actually mounted an outdoor show. You may know the Stedelijk is going through a massive remodeling, and so the actual physical building had been closed and restricted for quite some time, and so they wanted to actually try and create an experience, in the public space that still allowed them to reach out with art, and so this is one of the experiments that they did. You also have grassroots exhibitions, I guess you could say. This is the Virtual Public Art Project, started again in Philadelphia, where artists who created 3D sculptures and other experiences specifically for AR have basically placed these into an art exhibit in public. So it's kind of playing with the whole notion of, what does it mean when the physical museum is no longer necessarily the point of privilege for curation of art? you start to get into just more and more interesting visualizations here. I mean, a group of artists actually did an intervention, they call it, in the neighborhood of Bushwick in New York, and there were a number of different AR installations that were done around a specific, intervention festival, I guess you could say. These are just some examples of things that people have visualized, kind of mashing up Farmville into this, or taking, Facebook photos and mixing them up in some kind of a crazy swirl around the neighborhood. All experimenting, all visually interesting, sort of stretching for meaning. This was actually a very interesting one. This is a group of artists said, hey, why can't we hang our work in MoMA in New York City? And so they actually created an uninvited exhibition. So they kind of picked a date and a time. It was during the Conflux Festival that I-Beam puts on in the city. And they announced this, and they solicited artworks from all over the globe through the net, posted them up basically in the physical location of MoMA, and then went in, and people were walking around with their smartphones, oohing and eyeing at things that weren't there, and generally creating a stir. Again, it's really just playing with this whole notion of space and ownership and control over space, and it's worthy, I think, of working through. You're also starting to see people use the same notion in slightly more activist terms. So the famous image of the citizens standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square during the uprising in Beijing is now something that's also modeled in AR. And in principle, if you go to Tiananmen Square, you could actually see this particular model there. This may or may not seem like it's an impactful thing. I mean, you could say, well, the artist didn't really have to go to Beijing, didn't really have to get in front of a tank or anything like that. They just sat in front of their computer and created this. But it does raise the question of if you were in Tiananmen Square and you had your phone and were looking at this, and some agent of the government were to see this, they might actually detain you for looking at this quote unquote artwork of protest in Tiananmen Square. So there are political implications for this. It's just not necessarily the transgression you might expect for sort of directly creating, say, a sculpture in the square. Here's another one. This is the U.S.-Iraq War Memorial as envisioned by a couple of artists. They actually took the map of reported deaths from Iraq and essentially transposed that geography onto the geography of Washington, D.C., and then visualized it by little models of caskets, essentially, both U.S. and Iraqis' caskets. And this is interesting. It's powerful in its own way. Here's another one, right? This wasn't done with layer, but it's the same basic concept, right? Recognize something in the world and then augment it, in this case with an animation of a broken oil pipe. I think you know what that was all about. So the leak could happen anywhere. Here's some more examples of people putting protest images of various kinds into AR. Certainly during the time when artist Ai Weiwei was detained by Chinese authorities, there were a number of these free Ai Weiwei type graphics that showed up both in the real world. In fact, the one in the middle is actually a stencil from a Hong Kong street artist who created this as something that was passed around the net so that people could stencil this in the physical world, and it also got stenciled into the virtual world. And then, of course, most recently we have Occupy Wall Street, and because there's been a lot of crackdown on the protesters, one artist thought it would be interesting to collect images from protesters, which would then be placed into AR so that they could be at these locations no matter whether or not the authorities put them there. Now, again, is this an honest act of protest? I don't know. I think it remains to be seen exactly what this means, but certainly it creates some arresting images and some interesting things to think about. So I don't know if I've convinced you of this, but yeah, this is what I believe. And as I said, I do think we're really kind of in the early days of understanding this medium. We're still looking for, you know, our Charlie Chaplins. We're looking for the artists who will really kind of take this forward and really create, you know, things that are more impactful year after year. And some of that's going to be driven by the technology, but I think more importantly, it's going to be driven by the creative and aesthetic sensibilities of people who have access to these tools and can use them to actually visualize their own ideas and their own emotions and their own feelings. So, that's Layer, and that's me.
All right, so what we'd like to do is have this time to basically have the audience ask our presenters any questions that came up during their presentations. So is there anybody out there who would like to start off? No questions for these gentlemen? Yes, please.
You both sort of presented ways of looking at basically different realities. So I think you, Shah, mentioned the word described and versions, and the way you describe the world is essentially a version of what you create yourself. And in all these things, I think that, you know, sorry, Mr. Becker, this is the direction that we are going to head. You know, curiosity, I think, is going to play a very important role in that. But as always, the question is, you know, all these sorts of mappings and visualizations obscure as much as they reveal. And the question is, what will we lose? Which is not necessarily a negative thing, because all previous sort of technological, you know, obsolescences have both, you know, gotten rid of some things that we used to do and brought new things, which is not a bad thing. But I guess my sort of question or maybe fear is that, you know, we haven't quite seen what the potentially negative impacts of this sort of curiosity and mapping and virtual exploration is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, like, you know, that's a huge concern, right? Like, every time you make those kind of visualization decisions, you're kind of making an editorial decision about what story you're presenting. You know, the decision to make those crime maps literal numbers versus per capita numbers is an explicit decision. You know, we're definitely going to have to be very careful as we approach this. But I think as we become more exposed to these kind of visualizations and mappings, we also can become a little more literate. The same way we can kind of spot a terribly photoshopped thing now. Like, that's not truth anymore. That we can be a little more sensitive to the kind of media as we get accustomed to it.
Perhaps truth is not the right word, but more responsibility.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And, well, do you want to? Sure.
Yeah, I think literacy is certainly one issue, right? Just like any new medium, you have to develop a literacy so that people can understand what the meaning of what they're seeing is, and maybe have a sense of what's there and what might not have been shown. But of course, we've also seen, you know, in existing media that's always something that's hard to get through, and sometimes you see forces that are actually trying to obscure that story as hard as they can. For me, I don't know that we can, you know, sort of say, you know, let's take a position of, like, you know, authoritarian responsibility. I think what we're actually seeing here is we're going to see something that is a medium that anybody can create and contribute to. And so it's actually going to be a myriad of voices. I think of at least the AR medium as a lot more like the web than like, say, a designed visualization, for example. And so, you know, then it's going to be, so what are the tools that you use to try and navigate, you know, an incredible, you know, diverse and not always trustworthy, in fact, often untrustworthy space.
I don't know, sorry. Are you aware of, I'm a visual artist, and I also have spent the last 8 years being a graffiti and street artist. And are you aware of, like, Beck's in London, their new campaign, their, like, art campaign, where they have these virtual green boxes? Do you want to speak to any opinions on that? Because I was also on their website recently, and I actually can't even access the website because I don't have a smartphone. So I can't even find out information. I mean, not that I even drink that beer, but I can't even find out information.
Yeah.
I could afford the beer, but I can't afford to like find out about the art. It's not scary. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, so a couple of issues that are kind of embedded in what you just said. I mean, access is one thing, right? And so if what you need in order to access augmented reality is an expensive smartphone, then that kind of by definition is going to, sort of limit it to a certain, a certain group of people, people who choose to afford it, who have access to that kind of capability, who can afford the data plans and so on, who live in a place where that's even possible. So, it's definitely imperfect that way. The other thing that you talked about, I think, is the commercial co-option, I guess, of art. And of course, that's not a new story either. But the Beck's campaign is a really good example of one where you've basically got this big global brand who says, let's legitimate ourselves by having cool street art associated with our stuff. And
But it's virtual street art, right? Too.
yeah, but still, I mean, to the extent that they're actually using works by real artists, I mean, it's a little bit like, do you think that Shepard Fairey's work is any longer authentic or not? I mean, it's a debate you can have. What's the role of commercial, influence in that kind of artwork? But again, I think you're going to see one of the things I know that the folks that did the street art layer work have really tried to work with the street art community to make sure that they're doing things that the artists would actually sort of deem respectful. Because they think of themselves as artists, and I don't know, it's all very fraught politically.
All right, so I've been noting that like data plans are getting kind of expensive nowadays. We got rid of all the unlimited data and whatnot. And is there any kind of like way to cache maps and whatnot? Update via Wi-Fi and then kind of only take the information you need.
I mean, yeah, there are definitely maps you can start to use, or sorry, apps you can start to use, where you can start caching maps offline. I mean, I use that a lot when I'm traveling internationally, just because data is like extremely expensive for those kinds of situations. Does that answer your question?
I'm wondering, what do you guys are familiar with? What kind of use with personal data? For example, if you're at a conference and you could post a job opening for a Java developer on board, or you could somehow scan the room and people can publish that, hey, I'm a Java developer, and then you could actually go and meet them and find them, and reaching a person-to-person connection. And of course, there's long privacy issues with how much data is pushed around. But is anything out there happening now, or do you see things moving in that direction?
Yeah, so definitely I see a lot of folks trying to figure out things like how do you actually connect people together through these kinds of tools. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea that I could be like looking out at the audience and have my glasses or my contact lenses basically superimpose your Facebook and Twitter profiles over your heads, and you could do the same to me. To me that's kind of weird, right? I mean, that's, on the one hand it's attractive, but on the other hand I think it really is something that as a society we're going to probably reject for a long, long time, just because it really starts to get really deeply under the skin of what does it mean for people to have an interpersonal reaction, and have it be sort of direct as opposed to mediated through some other sort of social profiles and that sort of thing. But having said that, yeah, that stuff is already happening. I mean, people are trying to create conference apps that allow you to see who else is there and what their skills might be, and the scenario you described I think is out there.
I think that, like, for that use case you're talking about, that is actually, that's probably going to happen and is happening, but like that will probably stay. The opt-in kind of like, I am looking for, or I am in need of, that kind of thing. Did you see the project at F8? There was a Facebook conference maybe a couple weeks ago. They had a projection, and if you were walking by it, you had your conference badge, and it would show you, it would connect you visually with people you were walking near that you had friends in common with. So that was kind of like a surreal moment, because then it's not, I mean, you opted into the conference, but you're not necessarily asking for these connections to be drawn. But it's also kind of like creepily beautiful that you can start to bump people into each other with this kind of ambient knowledge that's there. It's not saying something creepy like this person's single and you're single, but you know, it's saying like you have like this line is really bright blue because you have 6 friends in common. Maybe that's like an interesting thing to talk about. So I don't know, it's happening, it's moving towards stuff like that.
Do we need this?
I don't know.
Okay, so and the flip side of that is that, you know, not everybody is like us, and we go to, you know, F8 and have a good time and go, wow, look at the cool visualizations, isn't that creepy? I mean, you've got an enormous community of people in the world who really, for many reasons, don't want to have that kind of exposure in public at all. Dana Boyd has done a lot of interesting research on the LGBT community and people in LiveJournal who really don't want to have these really private, almost anonymous facets of their personality and their online lives connected up in any way to the more public facets that they might have to present, at school or in a job or something like that. And the collapsing of those different identities that people try and hold separate, I think is a really huge problem. Not for folks like us that kind of live, in public already for whatever narcissistic urge, but for people for whom this is a really serious issue, might be an issue of personal safety, might be an issue of, you know what I'm saying, I guess.
I mean, in the beginning you said we are in the very, very early stages of researching and developing the technical tools, and in the future it's going to be the colored movie, it's not the nude movie anymore. So in the future I would assume people are not taking their camera or their smartphone, they're maybe wearing glasses, a glass is completely wired, we're running around. So at the moment it's still a very active decision to look through the lens, which makes it also editorial for us. We are on purpose switching on and off layers. I'm going to look at this and this. But when the moment it becomes an integrated tool, and when it's going to be successful, it's something I would automatically assume that it becomes completely integrated into something that we are wearing. What would be, out of your perspective, the advantage, the disadvantage, or the danger? Because then we are automatically really living in a layered world where the augmented and the reality is not really separate. I mean, we can't separate it in this moment. We're walking through the world.
Yeah. So I didn't really talk about the glasses scenario because the science fiction writers have done a lot of that. I mean, if you talk to almost anybody in the augmented reality business, that's kind of like their fantasy, right? We're just around the corner from having the glasses that you can put on so that nobody has to hold up their devices and do that whole awkward, sort of this thing. Aside from the technical complications, which lead me to believe that that's still probably a constant 5-year away, no matter when you ask, sort of development, I do think at some point we will have the capability to have that kind of a display apparatus that basically is a heads-up display for the world. And at that point, we will all have to confront what it means for our entire world, essentially, to have the same sort of public, connected, persistent nature that data does on the web today, right? Which, it's going to be a good thing for the applications where it's really positive. You'll be able to find anything, you'll be able to look at anything and know its provenance. You'll look at food on the shelf at the grocery store and you'll know whether or not it contains ingredients that you're going to be allergic to, so don't buy it. At the same time, it's going to be, they'll look around and see people and go, oh, yeah, okay, that person, worked in that job and got fired. And, I mean, there's going to be this very public notion out there, which we don't have the apparatus to deal with socially yet. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it evolves. I think we're also going to have the problem of if we get to the point where all of the information in the world starts to become digital and visible and visualizable, suddenly you have the 1,000 or the million things problem, which is in a vast field of information, you know, we're going to need Stamen Design and, you know, Movity and people like that to figure out, it's like, well, what should I pay attention to?
Yeah.
Right? Because attention's still going to be the scarce resource and all that.
I think there's not two futures like as distinct things, but like, I don't know, in the idealized future of this augmented reality, we all know who each other, like everyone is and what they're all about. Like that data is presented, then like, you know, I see like the positive future is like the one of small talk disappearing or something. Or like, you know, what Facebook has done to like catching up with friends, or like this kind of ambient awareness is there now. Like I had dinner with a friend I hadn't seen in like 12 years, and there was no catching up that needed to happen because we had followed each other online, like kind of throughout. And that was creepy, but also kind of refreshing to jump directly into conversation.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is then, you know, what happens if we then have to think about our lives as things we explicitly are presenting constantly, like manicuring ourselves, or like, you know, the like perfect Facebook status update to post. That kind of world is a little terrifying.
It seems like a bad idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost seems to me that in a world where if a person is visibly wearing the display glasses, right? And anybody can see them, they don't know what they're seeing, so they have to assume that it's like, oh, when I look at you, I'm Googling you. And so you're always going to assume that people are kind of doing the worst possible thing they could be doing, the most socially, you know, awkward or offensive or whatever. And, you know, it's like, oh, you're looking at me and you're visualizing me without clothes or something like that. Don't do that up here, guys, by the way. You don't want to know. But, and so I'm guessing that probably what we'll see is that it won't be socially acceptable for people to kind of have the Google glasses on in most social situations. It may be for professional work. I mean, certainly emergency workers and, you know, people who are working with data professionally will slip them on. But
It'll be like the turn off the phone during dinner kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's like take the goggles off, right? At least I hope.
It's a Google goggles.
That's probably not accidentally named,
Yeah.
huh?
I kind of wanted to get your perspective on, from like a stereotyping view as like an animalistic thing where we're coming from. As humans, we're still very much animals, and we still have these animalistic tendencies, and one of those survival techniques is stereotyping. So as we move into this space where we can sum someone up in a matter of seconds, what impact do you think that's going to have on actually reversing how much socialization is happening with things like Facebook now, and actually creating people that are more introverted and pulling away from each other and not initiating contact to begin with because they've got it all figured out for themselves?
I think the amazing thing for me about, you know, looking at Twitter or like looking at, I don't know if you saw like Twitter Vision was like one of the first, it was like a first mapping visualization, and it showed, you know, live tweets happening all over the world. And it was the first moment for me where I realized we were, like, in a visceral way, that we were on a planet together. Seeing people waking up in Tokyo when people are going to sleep in Germany is like a profoundly, like, emotional kind of experience. So I wonder if we even start to, like, if we have this kind of constant array of data that's incredibly specific about people, if we start to, like, my hope would be that we would start to look at people as individuals, or like, you know, accretions of stories rather than kind of stats. Like, I don't know, so that would be my hope, I guess.
I think we'll get digital cosplay. I think, you know, just the same way that, you know, people go and they dress themselves, or they dress extreme, or they adopt a personality. I think in a world where everybody could look at each other and think that they know everything about you, people are going to say, ha, no you don't. And they're going to create these, you know, very flamboyant personalities that they use to present as just another way to kind of screen out the intrusion of somebody who thinks they can get the 3-second précis by just glancing, right?
There was someone writing about that recently, about like, what is this strategy that we'll have to take up in the future of like, kind of the actual like giving people easy answers so that you can keep things, like the notion of privacy will change, right? So if you're an atheist, like, could you just put like one little trinket of like Jesus or something in your home so that when people see it, that latches on to, gives them this assumption of this religious identity that you have, that you can kind of hide away, and like what kind of red herrings do you have to place in your life to make people, you know, to throw them off your scent, right? Like,
Bizarre.
I guess I want to make an observation that I think leads to a question, which is talking about the different kind of data sets that I think that each of you are showing visualizations of. So Shaw, yours are probably, I assume, derived from GIS, which is census data and other kinds of kind of more governmental vetted kind of data, whereas Gene, a lot of the examples you were showing are more user-generated data, and each of them requires different kind of ways of filtering. So Shaw, you're in a way you're deciding how to visualize and filter that data. And it is interactive, but there is a kind of decision-making process before a user uses that, whereas the more user-generated data doesn't require that kind of filtering, but yet its veracity may be questionable. So I'm wondering if there is, do you see somehow those two different kind of types of data sets and ways of interacting with them actually ever being able to come together more or influence each other in a way that you get the best of both worlds? You get the veracity, but you also can, you don't have to have someone sort of pre-filtering or sorting.
Yeah, I think we'll have to constantly be kind of curious about the sourcing of information now. Like the crime data we're showing is actually the same crime data in that AR app. Mm-hmm. Like we actually partnered with Spot Crime also, which was funny to see. But like they're kind of, they're on opposite ends of that, like, bird's eye view versus, ant's eye view, right? And they're extremely different experiences emotionally and kind of, what the goals are. Like, the goal for us was, where is safe in San Francisco? That's kind of a very broad question. But, the AR experience is really powerful because it's what is that kind of spatiality of crime around me, which is a very different story. So, I don't know, I think I think we're just going to have to become, not going to have to, but we'll just have to start to question this information a little more. Like there is kind of the information as truth kind of thing that happens online, which is kind of this weird, I don't know if you guys saw this stuff on Twitter about like that Martin Luther King quote that happened.
Yeah.
There was like, Osama bin Laden was killed, and then this tweet got passed around that was a quote from Martin Luther King when it wasn't actually. It was like a school teacher's tweet. And so everyone was like, rallying around this quote that's completely false. And, what kind of like truths do we, like, I don't know, like, is that the responsibility of everyone individually to understand, or is that the responsibility of the people saying these things? I don't know.
I think we'll evolve trust models, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've already done that, in the media we have today, sometimes imperfectly, but on the web, you've got the notion of things like these certification authorities that say, well, I certify that this is a trusted site, trustee. You've got technical certificate authorities that say I certify this is a secure channel. You've got the notion of brands, and you get to the point where if you know that you've got Amazon.com as the address you've got in your browser, that you're on the Amazon website and there's a trust relationship that you've got because you know who Amazon is and you've done business with them and they've always shipped you the stuff you wanted and never stole your money. At the same time, there there's things at the boundary where you don't know whether you should trust it. I mean, phishing scams take, great advantage of that. It's like, oh, it kind of looks like a PayPal email, so if I just click here and give them my social security number, what could go wrong? Well, that's, taking advantage of the cracks in the trust models. And we're going to have the same thing in spades over, sort of data that is present in the world around us, and what's the equivalent of a trusted brand, a certification authority, and so on. That's going to have to exist, and there are going to be exploits against that too. I think that's one of the things that's actually, fairly worrisome, is that we're really talking. Bruce Sterling, the science fiction author, has taken a great interest in augmented reality, and one of the things that he said a couple of years ago was that AR folks are really the world's first pure play experience designers, in the sense that you're actually designing digital experiences for people in their real lives, in their physical existence, and that's a big responsibility, and it's also one where if the trust models break down, there actually could be physical consequences that are not good. So I think ultimately it's going to be important work. I don't think this is just virtual reality, which is just going to kind of blow by as a fad a couple of years from now. Just because you look already, you see the evidence of digital data accumulating in the world, everywhere, all the time, and it's just a matter of it's not just going to be data. It's going to be active services. It's going to be things that respond to the physical context of who you are and where you are and who else is there, and so big responsibility.
Sure, I have a question for you. I was very fascinated with your, the visualization in those moments when the spatial and the temporal realms blend and things become dynamic, and it's really great. You talked mostly about using mapping almost as a kind of a decision-making tool, right? If I want to buy an apartment, or if I want to park my car somewhere where it's safe, and that's pretty straightforward. I was wondering if you could give us an example of how that kind of mapping could be used by someone like me who's concerned with the physical world and making cities, a more livable, more beautiful, more sustainable, or safer place. So what's the next step? Like, could you use the same technology to model a scenario? Say, a group of students and I come up with a master plan, and so, I mean, have you had instances in your practice where someone asked you to use this as a design tool, actually, an urban design tool?
Yeah, I just have a quite similar question, so I just add this into this package. So I see what you're trying to ask, but I would even add, okay, it was developed by somebody who is a real estate developer. Right? And they have very specific intentions.
What is an agenda?
It has something to do with land value, etc., etc. So user behavior is streamlined through the map, because the map highlights specific aspects, and can even, at the end of the day, I would think it could even generate gentrification in a very extreme way, because for sure I'm not moving into the crime spot. And the crime spot becomes bigger and bigger because people are moving around, moving away, and because they're moving away, there is less social control, which will go and trigger crime as a reaction to it. So there is this fantastic tool that we can highlight all these aspects, but I think by using it as a visualization of the condition and not applying, hey, we have to do something here, it can actually become a very, I would even say, dangerous tool.
Yeah. I mean, there's even the inverse kind of visualization. A lot of people are mapping, vacant lots in Detroit and saying, hey, this costs $10,000 to buy this warehouse. Who's in? And you get this kind of rallying around the revitalization of an area around this kind of, very opportunistic kind of visualization of problem areas, some people would say. So I think it kind of goes both ways. It's definitely hard when you're trying to provide a decision. What are the kind of urban ramifications of everyone making that decision? I don't know if that's a world that I want to live in. But the fact that we can start to understand the physicality of that information is really exciting to me. The fact that things that are hearsay or kind of known but not said are starting to become things that people can explore. It took me a long time to realize that I couldn't live in Manhattan for how much I wanted to pay. But, you know, like, it would have been like a 2-second thing if I had actually had tools at my disposal. So, but on the context of like design, I think that's actually a studio I'm engaged in right now, is a studio at Berkeley with Nicolas Demonchaux. And what we're doing is, you know, using the ideas of mapping and visualization and, you know, GIS, all these tools, but not just to represent something, not just to make a decision on, but to start to find interventions or start to find points of attack. And through these tools, we can actually, you know, start to look at things in a systematic kind of way, not just design one park, but design 400. And I think the power of that kind of systematic analysis of urban information is going to be very interesting as like a design tool, where we can have much more impact and much more kind of a much more sensitive kind of knowledge of what the flows of information are, or what the flows of people are.
I'm interested in AR as a medium and comparison of it to the web. And I'm curious as to whether there are any initiatives towards open standards in AR, because the web is built on sort of ubiquitous protocols and that kind of thing, but it seems in AR there are these kind of big players and they have their platforms, and it's a little bit less kind of
Yeah, so thanks for thinking that there are big players. I mean, we're big players in a $0 billion industry so far. So, no, absolutely right. We don't have any sort of standards at the level of AR data representations and experience design representations. There are some efforts. I mean, there's an effort in the W3C to standardize at least the very simplest thing, which is really a point of interest representation as it might be used in AR. And you know, as these things do, that will take a few years to work itself out, and there are interconnections with so many other W3C and, you know, sort of beyond the web standards organizations that there's just lots of discussion and harmonization. And when they're done, they're going to have one little piece of it standardized. And I think it's premature to really think about standardizing, you know, the broader sense of even what layer does, which is pretty simple today, just because it's changing so quickly. I mean, you know, what we did 2 years ago compared to what we're doing now, and the kinds of things that can be augmented in the world, and the kinds of actions that can be connected to the world. Yeah, it's fast moving. And as we add in computer vision technology to recognize, you know, today, 2-dimensional images, and at some point in the future, 3-dimensional objects, and a broader and broader library of things, and you know, and fold in all the contextual data that comes in from, say, the other sensors on the phone. I mean, today you already know when you, in principle, if you have, you know, a cell phone user, a smartphone user, you know where they are, you know what time of day it is, and therefore you probably know is it day or night. You may have a decent sense of what the weather's like there. You know how fast the person is moving if you can basically record their GPS traces. You may know ambient noise. If you actually can analyze, you know, signal from the microphone, you could tell a lot about what's happening around them. You know, with speech recognition, you could say who's saying what, and on and on and on, right? So there's this incredible wealth of contextual information that's getting fed in, which, I don't know, when I think of AR, it's kind of like a piece of that, but that's the broader picture that it's part of. And because all that's moving so fast, I think the idea that that's going to get standardized anytime soon, I don't see how that's happening.
Or I guess other like open source initiatives in AR?
There are some. I mean, there's Blair McIntyre's group at Georgia Tech has been building an AR browser built on web standards. You know, and it's not like it has commercial traction, because that's not their goal. But because it doesn't have commercial traction, nobody's adopting it, and so I think it's going to be really hard for them to get anywhere with it. I mean, it's a neat effort, and they're doing a thing which I actually really support, which is trying to take the existing web standards and push them as far as they can into AR. So can you use HTML5 and, you know, the 3D stuff that's happening there and the canvas work and so on, and, you know, bringing in all the location, you know, vector stuff. That you know, could you build AR on top of HTML5? I don't know. It's a worthy thing to do. We're not doing it, but they are.
Well, I think we'll stop there, and I'd like to thank you who stayed for coming tonight, and then also Shah and Jean for presenting. So, one more time.
Thanks very much, guys.